This has actually been a fun couple days for me. As we were talking at dinner last night, my presentation is going to be very much from the view of a strategy researcher, where I'm studying macro effects, where we don't run experiments. But a lot of the discussion up to now has been from micro researchers who run experiments and that. And one of the things that I find really comforting about this, and one of, I think, the benefits of getting us all together is we're talking about a lot of the same issues, especially conceptually, and the things that we care about that. And I find that very reinforcing, and I find it also important as we discuss, what is the goals of the research that we're trying to do? How are we trying to advance science or social science in management and organizations? And so it's been really great fun for those reasons, and I hope to continue the discussion that way. So as a background to where I'm going, I just want to take a starting point for given, and that is there has been a revolution in empirical social science over the last several years in this notion that we focus on causal identification. So depending on which literatures you're in, and it's across social science, whether it be economics or political science or sociology or the empirical law literature, we'll call it the identification revolution or the credibility revolution, where, as we know, regressions will show us partial correlations, but what can we do to actually identify cause and effect? Because identifying cause and effect really gets to the root of both testing our theories, because our theories should have causes and then effects and outcomes, and especially being in a business school and often in applied environments, we want to give advice to people of what they should do. And knowing what the real causal levers are, that we need to know that to give advice. Otherwise, what are we telling them? So those are really important. So let's just take that as a starting point. But what I want to spend my time talking about is, okay, if that's where we are in the field of social science and causal inference is so important, how should we think about that in strategy research and macro-organization research? Because the main point is taking causal identification seriously is really important. As I mentioned, if we're going to give advice, we have to know cause and effect. But in what we study, that is fraught with difficulty. And just to highlight where this difficulty comes from, again, for those of us who often work in these macro fields, we don't run experiments. So we study organizations. They're really complex, right? There's lots and lots of things happening. We study outcomes that have many determinants. What affects firm profitability? Oh, gee, we can spend the rest of the day. When we get tired, we'll go back to the hotel, sleep. We'll come back tomorrow, spend all day tomorrow. We could generate a list. It's literally millions of things. That's where we are. Oh yeah, and then on top of that, we also focus on outcomes that organization actors purposely manage to. Well, this is not an experimental setting, right? No manager wants to lose money. They're looking to make money. Well, that's going to complicate the inference that we make. So what I would suggest is, we really have to be thinking about this, and not just because other disciplines are, because it really lies central to what we want to do as management and strategy scholars. But this is really hard to do, and I think given the nature of what we study, we have to come to our definitions or a consensus within our field of how we want to approach this. And we should not necessarily import it from other disciplines. And so just to give you an example, there are some disciplines now where, when I've talked to friends that are in developmental economics, depending what you do, you're expected to run a field experiment. It's mosquito nets in Indonesia or something like that. If the requirement, and many people see that as the requirement now in that field, if we import that requirement, I don't know how I'm going to study acquisitions, right? Because nobody's going to let me run a field experiment when they get to, some companies acquire companies and some don't, and I randomize it. That's not going to happen. That is just not tractable for us, which means that we have to develop our norms and expectations as we go through this. And so I want to give you my point of view of how we should be approaching this, but I think that this is not Myles gets to be king of strategy research, but I think it's ways to guide discussion that we as a research endeavor, as a field, begin to discuss this. So, causal identification. Why do I care? Again, I don't care about this because everybody else is doing it in the social sciences. I care about this because I got into this business because I want to inform managers on what they do. And if I really want to be serious about this, I have to know cause and effect. So that's why I care. I think it's fundamental to many of our goals. Do we do this? Well, to protect any individual paper, because we all do it. And you can probably dig up my papers, and I'm guilty of this too. Are we doing this? So here's an example from a paper in AMJ recently. Our findings provide insights into how and why X affects Y. They're telling me that they have causality. If I quote a colleague of mine, if I read the paper, that paper is a rat's nest of endogeneity. There's no way in the world that I would make any type of causal statement than that. But what else I'll say is, and you know what? And they solved it all for us in one paper. How nice of them, that we can move on. And then here, we'll take an example from SMJ where they're a little bit more humble. This is exactly what the paper does. And I think that this is a very credible explanation. We can show that X is positively associated with Y. That's great. So what do I tell a manager? You know, most sunny days, I like to walk outside. They're associated with each other or something like that. That's not cause and effect. If I want to give inference, I should be important. So, you know, maybe we're getting there, but you know, we're not really doing this. And I think it's important that we have to do it. So my proposal is that it's important that we start thinking about causal identification as a goal for a cumulative body of research. This is the target that we should get to, and no one paper is going to get us there. And this is a journey, and it's likely going to take many steps, given the nature of what we do, but it's important to start thinking of it that way. And again, reinforcing this notion of it has to be a cumulative body of research. I think this better reflects what we study, and I'll say this too, and the desire not to have empirical solutions determine the studies, the questions we study. If we start to care about causal identification for the sake of causal identification, we'll only study the things we can identify. Well, that seems backwards to me, right? We have lots of important questions. We are not lacking them. But if we only begin to study things where I can find a nice instrument, or I can find an exogenous shock, the world of what I can look at might be too small, and too small to be meaningful because our goal is to inform managers. But what I'm going to suggest is, to the extent that you buy in those first two points, actually I think doing that is at odds with a lot of the, or at least some of the norms in our field. And if we really want to approach causal identification as this cumulative body of research, we're going to have to revisit some of our norms. And I'll tell you, and I'll suggest what some of those are as I go through this. Okay, let me just give you an example. I'm too lazy to think of anybody else's, so I think of my own. So, used to study foreign entry, and there's this notion that if you're a foreign company and if you're a multinational and you're entering a foreign country, you have a choice of how you're going to enter. You could go acquire a company there, or you could go set up your operation from scratch. And there's this stream of research that would put together some theoretical arguments and would tell you why you're better off entering by a new plant. So going in from scratch rather than acquiring somebody. And you end up with a couple studies, 2 or 3 studies, that sort of systematically show that new plants outperform acquisitions. And especially up to this time, this is a typical strategy study. And if you read the implications of the work, what does it say? You should enter by new plant. They work way better than acquisitions. But here's the problem with that. Two-thirds to three-quarters of entries on average are acquiring companies. Nobody's doing that. The other thing is there's a whole separate line of literature that says, you know what? There should be reasons why you choose one of these versus the other. And then there's an empirical literature associated with it that's showing that managers systematically choose new plants in some conditions, systematically choose acquisitions in others. This is endogenous. And so the notion of my paper was, well, if we take into account how firms purposely choose entry modes, and it's really an instrumental variables approach, I think there's a decent instrument there, I can show that this effect, it's spurious. And it's consistent with our theories of choosing, because the people who are arguing, it's like, oh, you know when you choose to go in by your own and not acquire somebody? Let's say you're building a new plant. You have really good process technologies. You're better companies. So if you went in there and bought that existing plant, you'd have to gut it anyway and put all your new stuff in there. So you're better off starting from scratch. So the implications from these choosing are strong firms choose new plants. Well, you know what? When you implement the instrument, this goes away, because what was it showing us before? Showing us that strong firms probably do better. It's not a causal inference that just magically showing up and building a new plant versus an acquisition is good. It's likely this. Now, I could show this goes away. Did I show that it was really strength that is the causal lever doing this? No, I didn't go that far. Couldn't go that far, but that's where I ended up. But this is this notion of importance of causal inference. You can see that's a very different implication that I would tell a manager. It's like, you know what? Just build new plants. Never acquire anyone, because that's what the whole literature says. And what my results could show, and especially as I went through the structural model, and that is this notion that, you know what? It looks like managers are choosing correctly. New plants perform better in the situations where they're choosing them. Acquisitions perform better when they're choosing them. That's why things fall out. But this is this importance, again, of causal inference if we want to guide action. So, causal identification, what is it all about? And I want to be clear about this, because this might seem sometimes obvious, especially to all the micro scholars in the room who do your own experiments, because you think about this every time you do a study, because you collect your data, you collect the experiment. For those of us who use archival data or secondary data, it's out there. But the point I want to make is that for those of us using this data, thinking about causal inference is really developing an empirical strategy of thinking, well, how would I identify this if I could run the experiment? So it's all about research design. And for me, research design is about one word: variance, right? Are you invoking variance in that causal lever that you think it's coming from your theory that it's there? And so when you're in non-experimental data, you're asking, oh, the X in my regression model, what's actually moving that X? Is it somebody's choice? Is it random? Things like that. We want to be thinking about that when it's coming to causal inference. Can we actually detect variance in the outcome of interest? And can we measure it? Oh yeah, and then those other million things that affect firm performance, can we actually control for that? Right, so that's straightforward research design. It's probably obvious to all of you who run experiments, but for those of us who collect secondary, collect data that's archival or that, we have to be thinking about this, because this is underlying what we're doing. And sometimes that's not obvious. So what does that mean in terms of empirical strategies if I care about causal inference? Well, I want to put this whole thing up on the screen and highlight so much of the discussion I see now about causal inference only talks about statistical approaches. For those of us in the macro, we're not getting back into measurement or that, but that's really important to think about it. So just to walk through these things, do we actually directly measure that causal lever or not? Is it latent? Is it not? Can we get there? Do our constructs have validity? Again, I know how much time my colleagues in psychology spend on construct validity and measurement and that. Sometimes we pass that off a little bit more. Even if we can't do something about it directly, we have to be thinking about it, and what does that mean for interpreting our results, and how far can we go to make a strong statement about inference or not? Are our data good? Are they representative? Do we have effects that are meaningful? Yeah, and these statistical approaches. So can we find instruments within versus across variation? What I mean by that is that's this whole thing of, do you have fixed effects or not? Right? So do you have panel data? Do you rely on variation within companies over time rather than the cross-section to identify things? That can help me in inference. Do I have a control and a treated group, and I look at them before and after, differences and differences, regression discontinuities. So again, if you're not familiar with those, the notion of the regression discontinuity is, let's say that I have some prediction of the grade that you get in my class will affect your lifelong earnings or something like that. Okay. Maybe we can be a little bit, maybe it's like, do you go drinking at the bar after the exam? Maybe that's a little bit more direct. And let's say that we have a grading curve, and sort of I will get my knuckles wrapped if I don't give exactly 30% A's or something like that. So you go to so I go and it's time to assign grades. Let's pretend I have 100 people in my class, get to number 30, they're ranked, I can give them all A's. Now if you look at the person at number 30 and number 31, their grades differ by 1 percentage point or something like that. But I've forced there to be a cutoff. So I have subjects that would look almost identical to each other, but they get split on this cutoff. Some get an A, some don't get an A. They know the material just as well. It could be chance on how it's doing it. That's the regression discontinuity. So I can use this in a way to say that, oh, these are really similar subjects, but something, not to their control, threw them into these different groups, and being to these different groups has some causal effect. That's the notion behind that, right? And natural experiments are straightforward. Okay, so we have a set of tools, but the focus of causal identification as it is right now, here are my concerns. All of those approaches have their limitations. There are no silver bullets. And in fact, like I say, I think there's a bias, especially in the strategy and organizations literature right now, that the only solutions are the statistical solutions. And you know what? You could probably solve a lot of problems if you collected some better data. Yeah, that's real easy to do. It's easy for me to say, it's hard to do, but that is another approach. So I think that that's the problem, is sometimes we only focus on that, but none of them can do it alone. Same thing. You get beat up enough times that you're not identifying things. Well, it's like, okay, well now I'm going to start studying things I can identify. I can see how that happens, but the problem is there's a chance that we start giving up on the important questions. And like I said, some issues are inherently hard to identify, but they're important. Are you telling me that I can't study acquisitions anymore? This is a big strategic tool that has massive effects on companies, and if I care only about identification, I would never study that. I'll go a step further. I didn't say it early on. For most theories, if I really wanted nice, clean, good research design questions to go study the theories I'd want, business organizations would be the last place in the world I would go to test them, right? I'd go see how they're handing out fishing licenses in Wisconsin or something like that. And There's some random variation by county or something. That would be nice and clean for a certain theory, but I care about business organizations. Myles, you're right, this is really hard to do. So we're not going to worry too hard about it. Right? Questions are more important. Yeah, that's important. That's a concern also. Because it's hard to do, we shy away from it. Because we can't do it completely, we shy away from it. I don't think that that's necessarily pushing us further. So this is what's happening out there, and these are the approaches. And now let me give you a cynical view of where the field is right now because of these pressures. And I'll say this is probably more cynical than what I really think is there, but there's elements of truth to this. You can tell me if you believe. So I think we've broken into two camps. So we have the indigeneity and identification police in one camp. And the new theory is all that really matters crew in the other camp. And these guys, and that's the gender neutral term of guys, these guys think that these guys have no novel ideas. And these guys think that, oh, the only reason they want new theory every time is they're afraid of equations. And actually, running statistics that really would deal with these things, or they're actually really afraid of taking their ideas to real tests, because they only showed up through p-hacking or whatever. That's a little bit of a characterization where I think we are, and that is not helping us, and that's not going to push us forward. And so my proposal is, I actually do think there is a middle ground. And that both of these sides, they have points, but I also don't completely buy their objections to the other side also. And that's why I think it becomes important that in a field that is so applied, and given the nature of the data that we use, and given the nature of the questions that we want, we really have to start thinking about, yeah, we absolutely care about causal identification, but we're only going to solve this as a field as we move forward. And so thinking of it as a cumulative body of research. And if, yep.
Your previous slide was applied to the micro world in space, right? I think you defined
good.
Kind of two camps within our own world that line up completely.
And Paul, this is what I'll say is, just to echo what I said early on, what's one of the really fun things of these last 2 days, and there have been lots of fun things. All of your presentations have been great. They've made me think, but it's nothing better than to reinforce we care about the same things, we're facing similar problems, and it's how they're expressed might be different, and we might ask different questions, but we care about these. Yeah, no, thanks. That's important. So yeah, if we think about it this one way, it means we have to explicitly recognize no one paper is going to give us a definitive answer. And if you stop and think about it, I've seen as an editor people jumping up and down on a paper because you didn't have an airtight identification. Well, if you were expecting them to solve the world in one paper, I'm only giving you 40 pages to do that. Maybe if I gave you 60, you could solve the world's problems. But at 40, that's asking too much. So no, so if we start with this belief and internalize, no one paper is going to get us there. That also means that we should welcome papers that advance our understandings of causal effects related to important questions. And what I mean by that is, that's not new theory. And that's also different than replicating what was exactly there before. It's saying, look, I know you advanced a theory, or we have this theory in our literature, and you went this far. And that was a contribution. Here's what I'm going to do to get us further. right? Because causal identification, what it generally comes down to is, I've shown a partial correlation between these two variables. Here's my explanation for what's there, but there's also a host of alternative explanations. If we're living in a world where we haven't ruled out a bunch of alternatives, but you can rule out a few more, you're taking us further. I think that we should really be considering that type of paper as an important contribution. So, papers that advance causal effects, saying, look, we're here in terms of causality, let me take you one step further, I think that's a contribution. This also means that when I said before there are no silver bullets, it also means that we're going to need all these different approaches. We're going to need some that papers that might focus on measurement here. We might need some regression discontinuities. Might need some fixed effects models. We're actually going to need them all. We're going to need different samples. We're going to need different contexts. Can we use the variation here? All those are going to be important in pushing us forward. What this also means, and I'll put it in quotes, overturning, you know what? We're not going to find the same thing all the time. And we shouldn't expect to. And so just because there was a finding at one point in time and we have a better way of identifying it or a better way of measuring it, didn't mean that it was fraud before, didn't mean it was p-hacking. It could have been chance, but it just could have been where we were at that time. And there's nothing wrong with saying we were there before and this is where we are here now. Do I want this to be my paper? Yeah, probably not. At the same time, you know what? I know my paper's not fraud. And if that helped push us forward, and you say, you know, that was a good idea, but you really sort of flubbed this part of the identification. When I thought hard about it, I could do this, and it sort of helps send the research on a trajectory. You might not get credit for it, but that advanced the research. That's important. Again, if we care about this process. Okay, if you buy into that, and I think some of these are straightforward, I think this actually begins to push on some of our current research norms and assumptions in strategy and organizations. And let me pick on my favorite first. All papers need new theory. Because in my mind, here's the underlying assumption there. We must be the best scholars in the history of the world. Because what we're saying is, one, and we're done. But if you wrote a theory paper, it's none and we're done. Right? Because if every paper needs new theory, if I wrote a theory paper, well, nobody can really test it then. And so it just automatically must be right. And we can't revisit it because that's not a contribution. I think that doesn't make any sense. Now, I don't want to be misinterpreted. Am I saying we should never advance new theories? Of course I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, if it's come to the norm, and I'll say this, when I've been in an editorial position at journals, and the journal is not explicit that everything has to be novel theory. Lots of times, this is such an entrenched norm in our field, that's what the reviewers will start with, right? It's not new. And they stopped reading after second paragraph. Nothing you can do. Let me tell you also what I'm concerned about this sometimes when it comes to building a cumulative body of knowledge. You've probably read papers this way too. And like I say, in all these bad examples, you can probably find papers of mine doing this. So I'm as much as part of the problem as anybody else. But when we start out having to justify what we're doing is new, this is more or less what we do. Let me tell you how nobody's ever studied this, right? My paper is different than anything that has happened before. This is an exaggeration. But if that's the way you start your paper, how do we build a cumulative body of knowledge when all we're doing is sort of, here's where the research is, I got to go over here. And it's like, oh, no, now there's lots of space there. Oh, now one step back. right? We're dancing around, and we might be dancing around the problems instead of focusing in and addressing them. So I think that as a norm, and let me just say this because I mentioned early on, what I really liked about Jason, your talk this morning, and you're the editor, and I'll say this, I think your journal is very explicit in this, and that's fine in the set of journals, but the nuance and the way that you talked about it isn't this dogma, but I think the dogma is more entrained in the norms of the field than it is in the individuals who are the editors. So it's not an accusation about an individual. It's sort of looking at us in the mirror. I think, Steve, as you said yesterday, on a lot of the things that we're up to. Okay, so all papers don't need theoretical contributions. We have to relax that if we're going to follow this approach. The other thing I'll see is that people will claim, well, I have a theory, and it's consistent with the correlation. Well, my theory, since it's so good, I don't really have to worry about ruling out all the alternatives because it's there. Theory trumps causal identification. No, we can't believe that. It's great that you have a theory. You know what? If you really believe in it and it's really good, you should want to show that it can explain things that the alternatives can't. Then you should be really proud of it. But as an excuse not to do that, I don't like that. And this notion about, this seems to be a norm a little bit, that revisiting previous results is somehow about academic fraud. That's in the extreme. Or maybe ignorance, or they did something wrong. We can't believe that. We have to say that previous results are the stepping stone for where we're going. And if we move on, it doesn't mean they did something wrong, or they did something bad, or they cheated, but it gave us, an impetus to push this forward. So along these lines, if we would follow my suggestions, what does that make an identification advancing paper look like? You don't have to tell us how your theory is different. What you have to start doing is, we have a theory out there. And you know what? We actually have evidence for it. But we don't have airtight evidence. Here is where we are in our quest for causal identification. And here's how I'm going to push us forward. These are the alternative theories that sort of are striking. These are the other ways to look at this. This is a contribution. We will be here before. Now we're going to be here if I do this correctly. Then we document how we contributed to the quest. Here's what I'll say to reinforce what people have been talking about throughout these last couple days. I cannot do this if that initial paper wasn't transparent in what they were doing, right? In terms of design, in terms of measurement, in terms of sampling, or what's in there. That's why all these are important. All these are like the underlying, foundation for us to making these steps towards good social science, I think, and advancing. So I would clearly document what we did to contribute to this quest of causal identification, and how did we fall short? We could do this, and there's still this one other thing out there, but I think that we've, I'm going to try and convince you as the editor and you as the reviewers that knocking off these other ones was really a contribution, but here's where we fell short. We might reaffirm what we know, but if we reaffirm what we know with better identification, that's probably a big deal. And one of the things that often gets overlooked, if we have better identification, we probably start to get more meaningful effect sizes, even if we have directionally consistent results. That's one of the benefits of identification. What would we do next? What would be the next steps? Okay, so that's my proposal, is that I think that this notion of causal identification, there has been this revolution in the social science. And I think in strategy and macro organizations, it's more than what I can talk to, we really have to get on board. And the reason that we have to get on board is not because everybody's doing it, because it goes so fundamentally to what I think we do in management research, is we want to give practical implications to managers and policymakers. And if we do that, we need the levers. But when you stop and think about the phenomena that we study, it's not experimental. It's messy, and we have all these things. I don't think that absolves us from dealing with the issue. I think it means we have to take a different tack. And that tact is we have to solve the problem together by a cumulative body of research. And I'll end by asking this question, which I think has come up. Why do we do strategy and management research? Is it to help inform managers about important and complex problems and what levers they have? Or are we creating a self-perpetuating industry where we continually look to publish new papers or develop new ideas? Oh yeah, and I really like the essay that Jerry Davis had on ASQ, and even better if they're counterintuitive, because there's no better way to dance around and not get to anything focal as if everything has to be not only different, but things that you have never thought of before. I think that's a problem. Or maybe a little bit more fair, is getting better supported and more believable answers to what are those levers more important than only looking for novel explanations. And I'll just sort of end with reiterating, it's been a frustration of mine, as I think that, and I mentioned it yesterday in one of our discussions, I think over time we've become very narrow in what we define a typical paper. And it's not that our typical paper doesn't have contributions, it does, and it's important. But to the extent that we don't have abductive papers, or we don't have replications, or we don't think that there's a contribution in not advancing the theory, but advancing our tests of the theory, those are all problematic in my mind. And so there's a wide scope of things that we all have to be doing if we're going to push this forward as a cumulative body of research. I'll stop there.
I'll make this comment. So this may just be out of the blue.
Yep.
Why not?
Sure.
It's something I've been thinking about a little bit, but be more on the backwards side. Of course, a lot of my background is in methods, right?
Yep.
But I've started to worry a little bit. I started to worry some that our journals. Yeah, this is much better, right? So I've started to worry a lot that our journals are becoming almost more or overly methods related, even in their content. And by this I mean that there seems to be, for many of the journals, kind of this openness to publish articles about doing research, actually, than articles that are doing the research.
Doing the research,
and,
yeah.
you know, I'm a beneficiary of it, right?
Yeah.
Because I
So am I.
basically end up writing articles that talk about how to do research, how to apply methods to it. So, you know, I shouldn't be one to be complaining, but yet I look at the whole field and I say we can't continue to have just so much journal space devoted to this. And I think, you know, while editors and others become cautious about applications of them. You know, when you're talking about doing research, you can describe the ideal situation. Here are
Right.
all the perfect circumstances. Here's how it would really play out. But then somebody who's trying to take the method and apply it is, of course, going to run smack into reality, which is that there is no perfection. And so I wonder if we, you know, are kind of creating a bit of a nightmare here.
Actually, I think that that's a good point, because a lot of these methods types of papers, it's like, here's the ideal, here's the best way to do things. Let me show you how well it works on my nice simulated data. And yeah, try and take that to reality and how messy it is. And I think that, you know, Paul, you're right. I think in part of the call here is us, and this is us as a field, defining what does it really mean to advance things. So look, you had a great idea. you made some steps in causal inference, you should know where you didn't go. Somebody steps up and goes, Paul, you had a great idea, but you dropped the ball with respect to these things. I'm going to push us forward. I think reinforcing that than saying, let me tell you the method that's going to solve all problems, because sometimes that's, I think, how some of these methods papers come across is, here's the solution to all your problems. Now, the fact that there's 3 million assumptions on what else has to happen to get there is often not revealed. That's the sneaky little trick when you try and do it.
So one of the things I think is interesting, I mean, you've commented on this, Myles, but you know, we're talking about cumulative evidence as a basic foundation for science, and the novelty that is a problem across the entire journal space that we've been talking about.
Yep.
So I guess a question for discussion, right? Because I don't know what the answer is. How do we enact a cultural change? Because I totally agree. When you're a decision maker, that is a common reaction from a large proportion of the reviewing population.
Yeah.
And even if you're in a decision-making role where you can try to condition that and guide authors through the path, it's very well entrenched now, and it's clearly being communicated during graduate training, and probably during early experiences in the publication process, because you get other reviewers doing it, and then you're paying it back.
Yeah.
So
I think, well, one thing I'll confess, and I'm enough of a geek when it comes to research methods, that when somebody has a really clever research design, I sit there and go, this is so cool. I think that's a contribution. You don't have to convince me, because I think that there's an elegance and a thoughtfulness, and I know more. But you're right. What can we do to reinforce that? I'm giving the simple thing of, let me throw it out there, and I think we should be discussing it. But I'll say, going back to how I started it, for me, one of the fun things about this weekend is I hear this across our domains. And we have to think of a way to do it.
So here's a radical idea.
Okay.
Maybe there's a substantial number of journal editors here, active editors, across a wide swath of journals who have had the same common experience. I wonder if they could get together and write a common editorial that would publish across the journals. And of course, you could always try, I've seen,
Yep.
this has happened before. Some folks had a website to try to deal with some issues.
Right.
So you could try to recruit other editors to sign on board, and that would get a lot of attention.
I think that's great. Like you say, I'm open to anything. I fundamentally believe it's a discussion we have to be having. No, thanks for, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Myles, that was great.
Yeah.
So I think I would even take it one step further than
Okay.
you did on the previous slide. So I would say that if you are doing just generically what you say you are doing, sorry, maybe it was 2 slides back, but this was about offering, right, no need to describe how a paper's theory is different from previous papers, and so forth. If you do what you are describing, I would say this is a theoretical, or it can
Yeah.
be a theory contribution, because certainly it has implications for theory if you think about it as a better test of the underlying causal mechanisms and so forth. So depending how the paper is written and positioned,
Yep.
I think you can make a case that it would fit perfectly well under the mission of a certain journal.
And so Jason, just to reiterate, I'm glad you're recorded, and I want to go back. It's like, I think these norms, I don't know, that they've been reinforced and they come from, and they're not consistent with the people who are leading our journals, because I would agree with you too. If I can now say that we have a relationship and there are 2 dueling alternative explanations, and I can take us a step further to putting one to bed, that is a theoretical contribution. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I think about this, this dancing around in every single one. So for those of you who worked with me, you know that my wardrobe consists of, I go into the office in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. But you know what? Even I clean out my closet sometimes. And when it comes to management theories, I don't think we ever do that. Right? It's the one and done, and we get this proliferation. So sort of saying, can we get further? Yeah, no, thanks for the comment, Jason.
I don't want to revisit something you just talked about, though, but the role of reviewers in this whole process, I think, is a bit of a stumbling block, because this sort of received wisdom, wherever they got it from, I don't know. It may have been in a previous generation of editor team at a journal, and things they said were misinterpreted, or whatever this is. There are these received notions, and the reviewers just put them in the reviews. They hammer home, oh, there have to be hypotheses.
Yep.
There have to be, you did not discuss this particular issue in the right part of the paper, or in a top journal such as, and they insert the name of the journal. And it takes away from any discussion of substance. And it makes a job as an editor really, really difficult to, in the decision letter, to
It's hard to overturn everybody.
you can't overturn everybody, or if you do, to do it in such a way to say, well, this comment from reviewer one was valid, but ignore these other things they said. But it's the attitude of the reviewer more than the specific comment sometimes that becomes the really big hurdle. And the journal I'm associated with now is open to just about any kind of paper. It can be empirical, it can be conceptual, it can be documenting an interesting empirical phenomenon without testing things. Hypotheses, no hypotheses. We've been given license to accept papers and work with authors on papers regardless of the approach they take, providing it's addressing something that is potentially important. And it's fine to tell the editorial team that, and you can tell the editorial board once a year at the meeting and send out emails to them, but that's just not something that's going to happen that change isn't going to happen very quickly.
Let me ask you this, and this is also, so I agree, there's something reinforcing this, and Steve, this is maybe also addressing your question. I'm thinking out loud here, and that's probably dangerous since I'm being recorded also. What would happen if all of us revisited the syllabus that we use in our PhD classes? Do we have papers that look like that? I'm asking that. Or do we celebrate certain things? Do we all make them read, I don't, but do we all make them read that Murray Davis piece on things that are counterintuitive or interesting and everything else isn't? Does that reinforce, everybody's laughing because you have read it. But Kathy, I think that comes to that, and maybe also a shorthand, Steve, is, can we make sure when it comes to training our students that we are including papers that have this range? And do we celebrate them as much that have really nice identification strategies that take us a little bit further versus the person that came up with this counterintuitive idea as we go through the discussion? That might be one of the places to look too.
That segues nicely into what I was going to say, which is I assign a paper by Thomas Kuhn, The Essential Tension, where he's arguing that divergence is what people are largely wanting and asking for, particularly actually it was to a psychology audience, but convergence is what sciences that really make progress are really about. And so if you were to write the article, if we got the article that Steve suggested, what I would suggest would be something that would be described is that what we should be striving for is a relatively small list of major theories, and working on trying to figure out what those should be would be really important. And clearly another thing is which apply to which particular kinds of problems, much more lower level, but that's clearly what you're going to be doing a lot of, that's important. Because it would seem like a real problem with the issue of this program of research is essentially what you're describing is people will do it inside of their own lab, but they
Right.
don't do it across very
Right.
well. But if you had a relatively finite number of theories, then that makes this much more reasonable. And it's certainly the idea that someone comes along and says, here's one, by the way, that no one else has talked about and is cool, that could happen
Yep.
too.
Uh,
Right. So I'm not saying you wouldn't do
You
that.
don't want to preclude, again, if I'm complaining that we are shutting off types of research, saying that we shouldn't have novel theories, I think I'd be a hypocrite to say that. So I don't think that.
Pfeffer has a paper I know a lot of people disagree with about this idea of doing a paradigm. I love that paper.